RIAs, or regulatory impact assessments, it seems like it's a technical word that may not be very, may not be very familiar to an audience that's not an expert in the legislative world. So, to start with you, Daniel, how can we, tell people that RIAs are very important, and how will it affect their daily lives?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me in this wonderful event, and thank you very much for the question. I always say it's very simple. RIA, despite sounding very technical and something that is for experts, is basically a thought process that we use every day in our lives. When we decide what to wear, what to have for lunch, where to go for holidays, we always compare different options. We always take into account the costs attached to those options and the potential benefits, and then hopefully we pick up the best option. And this is exactly what we should do when thinking about regulations. First, we should think about the objectives. What are we trying to achieve? And there be as specific as possible. Then take into account different alternative solutions, including non-regulatory ones. So including not having a law, not introducing a new regulation. And then hopefully pick the best option.
So, Scott, you've worked closely with countries that have implemented RIAs. Can you tell us more about your experience in that?
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. And I have been working in the region with the World Bank team on introducing RIA into this area. You know, I think people do underestimate the importance of regulation. 60 years ago, governments had most of their power through spending. But that balance has changed. Now, government power is mostly through regulation. And regulation determines a huge, as Daniel was saying, a huge number of issues that determine the quality of our lives and the economic and social opportunities for the next generations. Now, this enormous regulatory state that is still growing quickly is undermanaged. We don't have yet, in most countries, what we have for the budgeting side, which is the modern unified budget, which is a century old. So the regulatory impact assessment process is part of this new governance management system for this part of the state, which has grown so quickly without proper oversight and management. And government and countries are making systematic mistakes, which are reducing the quality of life, reducing potential growth and opportunities in their countries. And regulatory impact assessment is one of the tools we can use to expand future opportunities across the globe.
Okay, so Daniel, going back to you, how can we ensure that RIAs are implemented, but without, creating more burdens?
Well, I think the easiest answer is to follow the OECD advice. I will elaborate on that. To properly implement RIA, you need to implement this tool in stages. None of the countries was able to implement everything at once. So you need to think about what is suitable for your country. There are no one-size-fits-all solutions. You need to start with a limited number of new laws, new regulations, and try to do a full-fledged cost-benefit analysis, including RIA, on those laws. You also need to create institutional structures, because it's very important to have what we call a regulatory oversight body. So someone in the administration, and preferably close to the center of government, whether it's a prime minister's office, presidential administration, government office, or something like this. So have a body there that they will oversee the quality of regulatory impact assessment and have sufficient teeth. So if the quality is insufficient, they have a right to send it back to the ministry to work again on the analysis. And B, to provide assistance. So act both as a policeman and as a coach to help ministries develop better impact assessment. But most importantly, RIA should not be seen as something that is done at the end of the process. I always stress that RIA is a process itself. It's a thought process, as I've just explained. So you need to start at the very beginning when defining the problem. Many countries, and this is the huge implementation gap we see, only do RIA when the decision has been made. to justify the decision that has already been made. That is wrong. That means that RIA only adds additional layer of administrative burden for them. It's much better to start at the very beginning and go throughout the process.
So Scott, Daniel is adamant that it's a process. What is the most important step in the implementation, in your opinion?
RIA is a multi-step process of decision-making. And actually, we can consider RIA as a process of learning. One of the words around RIA, which I always stress, and you rarely hear it when we talk about regulators, is humility. Now, often regulators believe that they instantly have the answers to the problems facing the country. And these answers spring out of their heads like magic in the morning. And that's a very dangerous moment in government, because the risk of failure and mistake is very high, because those solutions are based on preconceptions and assumptions and habits. And so what we want to do is create a process of learning and challenge in which channels of information from various sources, the public, stakeholders, for example, evidence, which challenges assumptions, are brought together and unified so that the regulator, at the end of the day, has the best possible base of information to make a solution that's going to affect the lives of millions. And so that learning process is really what RIA is all about.
May I,
please.
I quickly jump in?
Please.
I think that the most important part of RIA is problem identification. Someone quoted Albert Einstein yesterday, who said apparently that if he had 1 hour to solve a problem, he would spend 55 minutes on defining the problem and on only 5 minutes on finding the solution. And I think it's very critical. We as the OECD are active in the region, and very often we hear, we need a new law because we don't have one. Well, that's not the reason for having a new law. Or we need a new law that will do X and Y because all other countries have such a law. Again, that's not a reason to have a law. You need to have a problem that is clearly defined, and your objectives that are smart, specific, measurable, we all know that, and that only then you can think about whether you need a law or regulation or not.
Daniel, they always say that the implementation part is the hardest, and you need to bridge gaps. So what reforms do you think are needed to bridge these gaps?
One of the things that is very important is building analytical capacities. I've seen a lot of governments around the globe which are full of lawyers, and I have nothing against lawyers. I have many friends among lawyers, but they usually do not shine in doing cost-benefit analysis. So you need people who would be able to do the statistical analysis. You need economists, you need social scientists, you need these kind of analytical capacities to help you to implement and to carry out proper impact assessment. That's one thing. I've already mentioned creating the institutional structures, regulatory oversight bodies, and most importantly, do not look at RIA as an obstacle, as additional work. Look at it as a helpful tool that will help you to make better decisions.
Scott, how can governments ensure meaningful stakeholder engagement in the RIA process, in your opinion?
You know, civil society in many countries is unprepared to interact with government in an evidence-based way. And so there has to be preparation. And governments must take the first step. And civil society over time will learn. Canada did an assessment of the effect of RIA on civil society engagement. And what they found was that over time, the production of draft RIA and the publishing of draft RIA for comment and input increased not only the frequency of public comments, but the range of public comment from groups who normally would never have been involved, because they could see much more clearly the relevance and effects of policies on themselves. And so we were seeing, so RIA is a way of democratizing and opening up that process of consulting. But it does take time. The government should assist with extraordinary clarity. Publishing legal text, in my view, is not consultation, it is intimidation. We need to use RIA as a new channel, a more accessible channel to bring voices into the process.
Daniel, how do you think the assessment process should take place? Is there any methodology that is followed?
Oh, there is a lot of methodologies, and if you look at the guidance that some of the countries, the most developed countries, have in place, like the US, for example, Canada, Australia, you need probably a double PhD to actually understand whole guidance. So there is a lot of methodologies. Of course, the most developed one, the most useful one probably is cost-benefit analysis, but you have a lot of relatively simpler methodologies such as cost efficiency analysis, where you look really at how to achieve given objectives with the least amount of costs. You might use, and that's my favorite one, a multi-criteria analysis, where you do not need to do so many calculations, but basically you think about the trade-offs, what can be achieved with which tools, which cost that would bring. So the portfolio is quite huge. And again, my advice for those countries that are only starting with RIA would be to use simple methods in the beginning. Because again, I will repeat myself, I know that, but it's a thought process. So it's much more important than to have exact numbers in the end, to think about who will be impacted, which groups of citizens, businesses will be impacted, and how, then to have the numbers. And once you build those analytical capacities, you might pick 1 or 2 laws a year. There you can go with the full-fledged cost-benefit analysis and do the whole calculation.
So these are the methodologies. Speaking about initiatives, Scott, what initiatives are needed to make sure that regulators have the right skill to conduct proper and high-quality RIAs?
Well, I mean, we are trying to change an enormous ship, and to change its direction slowly, degree by degree. And this enormous ship consists of thousands of institutions and millions of people across the world who have habits and ideas. And all of that now has to work within a new framework of quality control, which we call regulatory impact assessment, and other parts of the regulatory governance ecosystem, such as transparency and so forth, and centralized quality control. Now, we have, at some point, we start, as Daniel said, we start with top down. There are very few countries where RIA started bottom up. Regulators, when I started with RIA in the Reagan White House, I know Reagan seems like ancient history to many of you, but we faced 800 regulators in Washington, D.C., employing about 1.5 million regulators. And not a single one of them wanted RIA. Not a single one of them welcomed RIA. And it took enormous leadership from Reagan and his team in order to get RIA into the system. And over the last 40 years, RIA has now been mainstreamed, and now it's impossible to think of doing regulatory work in Washington without RIA. It takes time, it takes leadership. Political leaders have to be engaged, and they have to be supportive. The reason why RIA fails, and often fails, is because ministers don't support it. Ministers are in a hurry. They believe that RIA just slows them down. Ministers already have solutions in mind, and they don't want to consider other options, and they don't want to listen to other ideas. So we have to make sure the political level is supportive and understands the benefits to the country and the government, and then we work from there in a downward fashion through the civil service.
So
But
the fear of slowing down the process, I guess, yeah.
There's a danger in that, because when I was a young civil servant, I was responsible, before joining the OECD, I was responsible for implementing RIA in the Czech Republic, following Scott's recommendation, actually, because at that time he worked for the OECD. And I almost became the most hated person in the administration, because I was adding people work. And when I got the offer from the OECD and moved, people were opening champagne. Finally, we will get rid of this guy implementing RIA.
So, Daniel, the one in, one out approach, what is that? Can you shed light on this?
Well, to simplify it, it's basically about offsetting regulatory costs. So for every new regulation that will cause additional regulatory costs, these costs need to be offset by getting rid of the same amount of regulatory costs by abolishing regulations elsewhere. Now, some countries focus only on administrative costs, the cost of paperwork. Some countries only focus on costs for businesses, so not for citizens, for example. There's a lot of variations. And then some countries were more ambitious and actually adopted 1 in, 2 out approach, 1 in, 3 out, and most recently the US administration 1 in, 10 out. Now, I think this approach is merely a communication tool. it definitely helps to spread the message that there are costs attached to every regulation across the administration. But when I worked on a study that was published by the OECD, we call it one in X out or OIXO, we realized there is usually a lot of gaming in the system. Countries are trying to make exceptions, not including a lot of costs into the system, or calculating some of the actual costs as benefits. So again, I think it's more or less a communication tool that might help in the beginning, that might force actually ministries, departments to build those analytical capacities and start calculating costs and benefits. But in the end, I don't think of any country where this would be extremely successful and where this approach would last very long.
Great.
In fact, during the previous US administration, when they had the one in, two out approach, in the end, the Trump's administration I'm talking about, they caused more regulatory costs in the end than they reduced. So it's not a silver bullet.
Scott, you wanted to add something?
Well, I agree with that. The only reason we have one in, X out is that we haven't been able to achieve a regulatory budgeting system yet, which is the superior approach.
Okay, and what are the key elements for the better regulation approach in your perspective?
Could I just want to mention a couple of things about
Please.
why it's so important now. You will be unable to change the regulatory ship of state without this tool. There is no example around the world of where that has happened. And countries are using this tool successfully to attack really important problems. If you have, for example, read the Draghi report, the Mario Draghi report from Europe, you'll see that the productivity lag in Europe, which so profoundly affects the economic future of the entire European single market, the entire European Union, is rooted largely in poor regulatory practices, particularly on innovation, risk-adverse practices. And the RIA will be used to address that and reverse that tendency by the bureaucracies. In the United States, the green energy revolution has been stalled by regulations on the grid. It now takes 10 years for a permit to be approved to change the grid to attach green technologies. The whole process has been stalled by an extended permitting process. RIA will be used to fix that. So RIA is a way of addressing serious and real problems in your systems to improve the future. And I think that if you want to change the way your government regulates, to be more inclusive, to be more innovation friendly, to have better results at lower cost, I think RIA is one of the tools you should be considering.
Daniel, going back to you, in every implementation process, there are challenges and ways to overcome them. What do you think are the most important?
Well, I've already mentioned many of them. Some of them might be the fact that some people still perceive RIA as something being inherently pro-business, as really a tool that is focusing on limiting regulatory costs for businesses. And the truth is that in the beginning, in many countries, it was used as such a tool. But in fact, regulations, including regulatory impact assessment, are tools that help governments to achieve their goals. And Scott mentioned that in the very beginning. Regulations are a very important tool if we want to achieve just digital transformation, if we want to tackle the climate change. We, in some cases, will need to use regulations. However, to make these regulations work, you need to look at RIA as a tool that will help you to find better tools and to answer the question whether regulations are actually the best tool to achieve those goals, or whether you can maybe better enforce the existing regulations, or even get rid of some of the existing regulations, or just provide better advice, or focus on compliance promotion.
So these are the tools or frameworks that have proven to be most effective, in your opinion?
Well, no. I mean, the tools that are most effective, again, training is very important. Training is crucial. starting with awareness raising. Scott mentioned that in some cases ministers are not exactly very supportive when it comes to RIA. You need to explain to them what RIA is. Again, it's not an obstacle to their work. It's not an obstacle to promoting their ideas and implementing their ideas in practice, but it's a tool that should help them and their civil servants to make better decisions. And then you need to train your civil servants, is first of all explaining what RIA is, what is the process, and then choose selected experts and build analytical capacities and train them in carrying out cost-benefit analysis using those different techniques. We on the OECD work a lot with many countries actually in training their civil servants in regulatory impact assessment, but of course our capacities are quite limited, so it's not enough. There is a lot of other companies that are doing that. So focus on training, awareness raising, promoting the idea, and have a lot of political support.
Scott, AI. How can we use AI to predict whether RIAs are going to be effective or not?
You know, I've seen a lot of claims about AI and RIA, and I've reviewed a number of pieces of software. Please don't believe you can buy AI software to replace your RIA analysts yet.
That's good to know.
You need to have, I think the AI software is useful on several of the 12 steps of RIA, but you need to have a trained and capable staff and team in your ministries and at the center of government who know what questions to ask, who know what trade-offs to make, who know what the contextual and contingencies are around which decision-making is made, because AI doesn't know any of those and cannot make those decisions. So there's a tremendous set of value judgments. I mean, people sometimes think that this kind of analysis is economists and statisticians taking over the world. But that's not correct. The information is filtered through a process of values, and that those values come in many ways. How we determine what kinds of costs to measure and what kinds of benefits to measure and how to compare them and how to balance them and so forth. All of those are values that come from the political and cultural system of the country. And of course AI can be useful, but AI will be only useful to you if you do have this trained team who is ready to use the RIA system and can use AI intelligently to speed up the process in collecting data and assessing alternatives and so forth.
So training your employees.
You need to have capacities. You cannot replace people with AI at this stage, and maybe not for many years on RIA.
Yes, because many people actually believe that RIA is a magic formula. You put some numbers in on the left side and you get an ideal solution on the right one. No, it's not like this. AI can help. I absolutely agree with Scott. AI can help with certain steps of the process, but it's the people who make the decisions in the end, and it's a process of thinking.
I'd like to make one point here. So in the United States, about 4,000 regulations are considered by the federal government every year. And of those 4,000, 400 full benefit cost analyses are done, or about on 10%. Those 10% of regulations comprise around 80% of the costs and benefits of the 4,000. So now of that 400, in which they spend a lot of time and effort doing a full benefit cost analysis, the politicians accept the recommendation of the RIAs only 50% of the time. And the other 50% of the time, the politicians choose either option B or some amended version of the recommended superior option. And people say to me, doesn't that mean RIA has failed? And I say, no. To me, 50% of the time, the analysis is good enough for the politicians to say, yes, that's the future. And the other 50% of the time, the politicians have enough information to make alternative choices, and they understand the consequences of those alternatives. But RIA is never complete. It cannot be comprehensive. And so politicians are there to bring in other values that may be missing from the RIA, and that's perfectly legitimate. So, you know, we cannot use RIA as some kind of, as Daniel said, some kind of magic tool which is going to make difficult decisions. It's an input and an assistance, but we still need smart people who ask the right questions and who bring values to the table.
One more thing, sorry. Which we need to mention. RIA is not just about choosing the right option. It's also about preventing unintended consequences. Sometimes you just don't think about a technical issue, you don't put it in the law, in a regulation, and by mistake, you might destroy the whole sector of the industry. Or you might have, and it actually happened in our practice in the Czech Republic, you might have hundreds of people protesting in front of the government office, not because bad intentions, but because there was a mistake in drafting a technical regulation. This wasn't consulted properly with all stakeholders, and then the result, protests and the government needing to amend the regulation. So it's not just about making decisions, choosing the best solution, but also preventing unintended consequences.
It's really a risk management process.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
So, Daniel, to what extent should RIAs prioritize quantitative versus qualitative assessments in evaluating regulatory impacts?
I mean, in the ideal case, we would all work on full-fledged cost-benefit analysis on every single law or every single regulation. But none of the countries have capacities for that. It would be a waste of time, it would be a waste of resources. So I think if in the most developed countries, if you have capacities, then aim at quantifying as much as possible. But the advice we give to countries that might be only starting with implementing regulatory impact assessment is please start with qualitative assessment, start with some kind of two-stage RIA. That means do maybe what we call a small RIA for all new laws and regulations, very qualitative, quick assessments about who will be impacted and how, and then only for a very limited, selected number of priority regulations with potentially biggest impacts, try to quantify. But there is also the issue with data availability and data sharing across the administration. Now, in many countries, we hear, well, this is all nice, the method is all nice, but we absolutely don't have any information, even maybe about how many subjects are operating in a certain segment of the economy. Well, our answer is, first, you need to start building those databases, this information base, because how can you regulate a sector without having basic information? But there might be more advanced data requirement, and sometimes this data is available in the administration, but it's elsewhere, so you need to work with your colleagues from different departments, different ministries. Sometimes it's available in the outside world. You need to use think tanks, academics, AI potentially that can help you with finding the right data. But if you don't have the data, you don't have the information, and it's not possible to find it somewhere, at least you should think about what kind of data and information you will need in the future and start building this information base. That is very crucial. So coming back to your question, start with qualitative, go quantitative only if you have the data, if you have the capacities. If you don't, start building those capacities and databases.
So we have a few minutes left to end this wonderful, insightful discussion on a positive note. Can you give us examples about the successful implementation of RIAs? Scott, you want to start?
Oh, well, there are so many, but you can see in the European Commission, for example, which is a highly regulatory culture. The Europeans are risk adverse by nature, much more risk adverse, for example, than the Americans or the Canadians or Australians. And so they like more regulation. But even there, you can see that RIA has gradually over time shifted the European Commission from a top-down, market-controlling regulatory approach to a more facilitative approach in which actually the regulations focus much more on market information and transparency to allow consumers more choice. And you can see that in the IA Act, which was so critical. And the IA Act, when it started 3 years ago, it took 3 years to draft, was actually highly controlling. It was actually based on product standards. It was a Product Standards Act. And when it finished 3 years later, after a lot of RIA and a lot of consultation, it became more about information to the market so that people could understand risks and manage risks that they were facing, both businesses and individuals. And you could see this also in ESG regulation, where the more controlling options were rejected in the RIA, And in fact, ESG regulation became more of information. So you should know, for example, the source of data used in an ESG rating, and you should know the conflict of interest in the ESG rating agency, and so forth. And so they moved to a more market-based approach, and I think RIA has been extremely helpful to them in sorting out the bad options from what is a more facilitative and more innovation-oriented approach.
Daniel?
Well, I also wanted to use the example of the European Commission, so let me go maybe to slightly less developed economies when it comes to regulatory policy, of course. We work a lot with Croatia, where RIA is actually used to prevent unnecessary regulatory costs for businesses. And I think implementing this approach according to their calculations has contributed to limiting unnecessary regulatory costs by over, I think it's 150 million euros a year for businesses, by thinking about different options, by talking to stakeholders, talking to businesses. There are many other examples of countries that have implemented RIA, at least partially or successfully. Even here in UAE, we are working with the Abu Dhabi Department of Health for many years actually on improving their RIA framework. We are working with Saudi Arabia. So there is a lot of examples across the globe from which you can take lessons.
One more example there. I think that if you're interested in RIA, look at South Korea, which recovered from the Asian financial crisis in 1998 with these instruments. That's when RIA was introduced. Today, Korea is the most innovation-friendly country in Asia, and RIA is done for every regulation, not only at the national level, but at the provincial level and at the municipal level. I mean, it's a very, very strict process of consultation and analysis of rules and regulations across the board. I think South Korea gives us an example of what, after 20 years of effort, any country can look like in a transformation of their whole regulatory system.
Any other examples with emerging economies in the Middle East?
Oh, I mean, there are plenty. So when you look, South Africa, we just had a speaker from South Africa. South Africa has been experimenting with RIA. And interestingly enough, Daniel talked about customization of RIA early on, which is really critical. You don't want to just take someone else's RIA because it reflects values. One of the values of South Africa was inclusion. So when you do a RIA in South Africa today, one of the questions the RIA must answer is, what is the effect of this policy proposal on the traditionally excluded members of society? And here we're talking about people who are traditionally excluded from jobs, education, medical services, and so forth. And if a policy has the effect of worsening exclusion, it will be rejected as an option. So the RIAs, as Daniel said, they're not only about business costs. I mean, people do have that misconception. You build into the RIA the values of your country, and you use RIA to exclude options that move you in the wrong direction. And so South Africa, I think, is a country that has invested quite a bit in improving the quality of policy making through the RIA system.
So time is up. Scott, Daniel, thank you very much for this insightful session. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending.
Thank you.